As an angling program maker, I've had the privilege of working with some of the best anglers in the world, and over the years I've been able to glean a lot of good information from the top players of the game. During the course of this programme, I shall take advantage of that experience, and indeed the LDTV film library, and where appropriate, we'll cut away to one of 3 people I've found to be the clearest at demonstrating important aspects of our game.
Always, when you miss a bite, always come back in.
The king of course is, of course, the legendary Bob Nudd. 4 times world champion and an MBE to boot, he's proven over the years to be the most popular angler in front of the camera.
With a new one. 2 little maggots. When you hook these maggots,
My prediction of a future world champion and rising star is Will Raison. It won't be long until he brings home the coveted crown on behalf of Angling England.
Towards the corners or just out of a corner. The middle of a bank is always, for some reason, one
And finally, the tallest professional, and the one who gives a shorty like me a crick in the neck, is the ever-reliable Bob Roberts. Steady and sure, his techniques and tips have proved invaluable over the years. Another gentleman of the game. Here's a rather extraordinary statistic that may or may not be totally accurate, but it gives you an idea of where I'm coming from. 95% of all fish caught on rod and line are caught by 5% of the anglers. Food for thought. When I look back at how I went about fishing during the early days, I don't half mock myself, and I see that really I had very little chance of making it happen. When I were a lad, there were no videos or DVDs to offer guidance, and even a book was a pretty expensive item for a would-be angler trying to find the loot for a rod and line. The most you could hope for was success by trial and error, and if you were lucky, an older angler would tuck you under their wing, bung you a few cast-off bits and pieces, and a few tips and tricks to help you on your way. These days, in a PC-mad world, the would-be has a lot more information available on video, DVD, and online. The cartel price structure of books has long been broken, with publications now at sensible prices, and the world of angling knowledge is just a cast away. There's no better place to begin your coarse fishing career than at a commercial still water, a managed pay-to-fish lake. Many offer excellent facilities, including a cafe and toilets, and you may even find a tackle shop on site. Quite often you can park your vehicle close to where you fish, but best of all, they're heavily stocked, so you're pretty much guaranteed some action. If you're a complete newcomer to fishing, there's no easier way to get started, frankly, than by fishing with a pole. Modern poles are made from tubular carbon fibre and don't require a reel. Instead, the fish you hook are tamed using an internal elastic system, rather like a bungee rope. Each time a hooked fish tries to swim away, the elastic stretches and the tension increases, making it harder and harder for the fish to swim away. This soon tires it out, and you can quickly draw it into your net.
Solid.
So let's begin with looking at buying a pole.
This is brilliant. I've only been fishing about 10 minutes and I'm already catching fish after fish.
Poles can be relatively inexpensive to buy, but you really do get what you pay for. The most expensive poles on the market can cost several £1,000s, but much cheaper versions can be bought for under £100. The secret, in reality, is to spend as much as you can afford. Buy the longest, stiffest pole that your budget will stand. As a rule of thumb, don't go for anything less than 11 metres long, and make sure spare sections are available from the manufacturer. Beware bargain offers. Many that you see advertised are old stock and no longer in production. This is fine until you have an accident and tread on a section. What do you do then when you can't replace it? A good pole is a stiff pole, something that's very important on commercial still waters where hard fighting carp predominate. Rigidity, though, comes at a price. Cheap and stiff equates to a heavy pole, which in turn leaves you well tired at the end of a day's fishing. Lighter, stiff poles are available, at a cost. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation, so just remember, if you buy a bargain, the chances are you'll buy another pole pretty soon. It usually works out cheaper to bite the bullet and buy a decent pole first time around if you really think you're going to go coarse fishing on a regular basis. Find a good tackle dealer and listen to his advice.
Gonna be careful because it's so big.
You'll need to elasticate your new pole before you can fish with it. This is done by threading elastic inside the top 2 or 3 sections. The best way of demonstrating this valuable money-saving technique is to go live to our Bob and let him show you. Take this method on board and you'll be able to replace or install elastic without trotting into a tackle shop. Sorry guys.
Elasticating a pole is something that a lot of anglers are frightened of, and you shouldn't be, because it's so easy to do. And I want to run through exactly how I do it, and if you take these sort of few simple steps, you'll find it's okay, it's quite easy. Start with the bush. You have to bush. The kit I've got here is a top 2 carp kit. It's equivalent to a normal top 3 on a standard pole. And if you can just see that bush there, that's an internal bush. I like to use these because if you can imagine, if you use an external bush, your line can get caught behind it quite easy. But there, can you see how smooth that is? Nothing can get caught. These are the bushes that I use. They are Preston. They're called slip. They're a PTFE bush. And on the back, it actually tells you what size bush for what size elastic. You need to cut your pole back. Now, it's carbon, fairly fragile. And, well, this is what they call a needle file, a knife-edge needle file, and that's better than trying to. A hacksaw's far too abrasive, far too abrupt. But this is nice and fine, but it doesn't take long, and you can actually cut the pole to length quite easy with that. I bought a whole set of these. You know your local market store. Bought a whole set of these for I think £2. It was about 10 different ones, so, and this lasted me forever. Those. Once you've got your bush in place, you push the bush in, and I actually just super glue it. That's all it needs, just super glue it in. It wants to be a good tight fit in there. Push it in, super glue it, it doesn't move, and that's for the elastic to slide round. So that's the bush end done on your top section. And you vary that depending on your elastic size. This one is perfect for a number 10 elastic, which I'm going to use. You need also then to make a bung for the end of the second section in this case. Now this is, if you have a look at that, there is an actual, like a little winder on there. This is called an adjuster bung. This enables you to adjust the elastic, tighten it up if you're catching big fish, slacken it off if you're catching small, so you can do whatever you want. So it enables you to adjust the elastic. Normally, and what happens is they come bigger than this over length, but you can see all these little grooves in here, those grooves, and you can use, what I use is just a Stanley knife to cut this down to length. It must go inside the pole. Bear in mind, now look at that, look at the end of your pole there. Your next section, your number 3 or 4 joint which goes in there, must go up inside there, so you've got to get this piece to go up inside as well. So I've cut this to length, just so it probably goes up 5 or 6 inches inside this pole there. I've already cut that one to length for you, but so that there, the bung, the adjuster bung is the right size. We've done the tip. So that's the start of it. This is one thing you must have for elastic. It's called a diamond eye threader. A diamond eye threader, and of course it explains itself. It's just a piece of wire with, if you can see that, a diamond eye which you can slip your elastic through. You can put your elastic through that diamond eye threader and it grips it. it will actually grip the elastic. If you push it through there and pull, can you see how it grips that elastic there? So you can then thread this wire down the pole. You need to start threading from the bush end, just pushing the wire through. And because it's wire, of course, because it's fairly stiff, you can thread that through, just whiz it through as quick as you can, until you see the wire just coming out of the other end. Once it comes out the other end, of course, you can then, there it comes out already. I'll just show you that now. You can just see it coming out of this end. So you can now then pull through. You've got that diamond eye, which has got a grip on the elastic, just pulls that elastic through so easily, like that. First section through. You've now got to do the same on the next piece. This is easier because, of course, it's much bigger. So on this carp section there, this will be the second section, just whiz that through. Same thing. Push it through and get all that elastic through. Pushing the wire through again, it makes it so much easier, this wire, this threader. Repeating exactly the same as you did before, where you actually push this through, pull it. Just need a bit more room to work there now. Pull it through. And as you're pulling it through, you need then just to put those two sections there, just put them together. Just put them there together so that it then comes through smoothly. You've got the two bits together. Now you've got elastic out now at one end, at the tip end, and elastic here. This is the bit at the bottom that you do first. You can discard now. You've finished with the wire. Now you need the bush. And this bush, it's got loads of holes in it, look. See all those holes? Well, on these adjuster bushes, see this hole here? This one right, let's have a look, at the back there. If I can show it to camera there. It's the one just above that adjuster bung. That's the one that you tie your elastic to. And this is such a simple knot. This is why I wanted to show it to you. You need just to loop the elastic round the adjuster bung, and then just do a normal granny knot, just a normal loop. Always wet, whenever you're working with anything, especially with elastic, wet that elastic a little bit. Just form a loop with your hand, you see that? And bring this bush back through so that you get just a normal, ordinary, it's just a normal, ordinary granny knot there. Can you see that? Pull it just reasonably tight, just so it starts to dig, and then finish it off by getting hold of the tag there and the elastic there, and then pulling it down. That then will be, it sort of, because it's elastic, it digs into itself, but always just give a real check like that to make sure it's not slipping. Look, that elastic is bottoming out, the knot's not slipping. So there you are. That can be then trimmed off with a pair of scissors. Just trim that piece off. You can leave a little bit of it on if you want. So just trim that elastic like that. Now you need to just put a few turns. This is an adjuster bung, so you need a little bit of insurance there. Just for how, so just I wind probably 5 or 6 turns round this bung, like that. Then put it under, so there's 5 or 6 turns on there. I can either add a few more on or take a few off before I do it. And then I'll pull that bung, then pull the elastic at the other end, and that will pull that bung up inside there. Just get this elastic right, and it'll pull that bung up inside. Need to come back to this tip end now, just to pull this elastic, so that bung now comes up inside the pole, settles where it should do. And this is the real secret. This is the Bob Nudd secret. If you've ever been fishing and you do all this elastic, if you can do it, and you go out and your first big fish you hook, there's a load of elastic hanging out of your pole. The reason is you haven't pre-stretched the elastic. You need to do that, before you put this bush on the end. Just form a loop, ordinary loop, granny knot, anything. Not going to tie it yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this loop to pre-stretch that elastic. Pull it tight so that knot doesn't slip. Like that. You got that? Trim it off. Just going to trim that elastic off there. And then this is my party piece. You've got to hook this. I usually hook it on my garden gate, but I haven't got my garden gate here, so I hook it around anything and then walk with it and pre-stretch it. Just like a big fish is going to take your bait, you've got to do that. You've got to stretch this elastic, walk with it, hook it round anything. I think I'm going to use a bit of my box down here. Let's have a look. Perhaps if I hook it round there, that should hold it. And I can then walk with this, and that's like a fish. That's like your first fish, but you walk with it and walk until you feel the elastic just bottom out. And then you just keep pulling and pulling. And this is where my neighbours start looking at me as I walk out of the garden gate. So you're pulling until you feel that elastic just start to bottom out. Once you get to that point where you just feel it, you've then pre-stretched it. So you've pre-stretched it and you can come back and you can see already, I mean, that elastic was quite tight, and you can see now how it's hanging out there. That's a bit of loose because I've pre-stretched the elastic, so I've actually used it. All that remains then is just to tie the bush on this end, and sort of, you've got a little bit, you can adjust the bung there, so you can make it a little bit tighter or a little bit looser. It doesn't matter because you can adjust it. And I use a normal, these are good connectors, these are Preston, this is a Carp Extra. That's what I would normally use, one of those, just to do it, to tie it up. Trim off that, you need to cut this piece, we don't want this piece on here now. Elastic sticking out. With these connectors, you need to thread, there's a small yellow piece which you need, or whatever colour it'll be, you need to thread that on first. And then you've got the connector itself, it's got a little hole there, thread the elastic through that hole, and then you've got to think of the tension. Before you tie it, just feel the tension on the elastic, think, oh, let's do that a bit more, let's do that a bit more. That feels about right. So keep your fingers on there, do the same knot as you did before, wet the elastic first, I'm wetting my fingers, wet the elastic first, do that same, just a normal granny knot. What's happening is, this is elastic, it digs into itself, doesn't cut through like line, so you can, it's okay to use a normal granny knot on there. Just pull it down fairly tight, get hold of that loose end, pull it. As you're pulling it, it will dig in. It will dig in like that. Then test it. Then really test it, pull it, not slipping at all. No problems, done as easy as anything. Clip off the excess underneath. Elastic's sometimes hard to cut through, isn't it? And then just push this bottom piece of the bung up like that, and there you have it, perfectly elasticated. You've got a piece on here where you can just hook your line, but perfectly elasticated, slipping back. I also use lubricant as well before I start to fish, but because elastic, it's rubber, it's like the car tyres that you've got. It doesn't really want to slip over anything, does it? So there you are, perfect elastic every time.
Good one, Bob. Money-saving information. OK, so your pole is now ready. The next step to look at is pole floats. There are hundreds of different floats on the market, and the choice can be somewhat confusing, so let's look at the basics. A float consists of three main elements: a stem, a body and a bristle. The stem will be made from materials such as cane, nylon, carbon or wire. A cane stem is used when you want to catch fish on the drop, in other words, at all levels in the water. Nylon and carbon are robust materials and favoured by many on commercial waters where hard-fighting carp make matchwood out of cane stems. Wire stems give stability, especially on windy days, but again, bigger fish like carp and tench will soon bend the stem. The body of a float gives it its buoyancy. It can be made from balsa wood or polystyrene. The material doesn't really matter, but the shape does. A slim body is suited to the aforementioned fishing on the drop. A teardrop shape with the widest part near the stem is ideal for still waters, while the same body fixed the other way up is the perfect choice for slow-moving rivers. Keep it simple at first. Choose one with a slim teardrop-shaped body, bulbous bit at the bottom, and preferably with a carbon or nylon stem. These will stand up to more hammer than the cane or wire stems. Don't be afraid to ask the tackle dealer for advice. That's what he's there for. Most will go out of their way to help you. A rig is simply a length of line complete with a float and the appropriate number of shots required to sink it to the bristle. It's retained on a plastic winder to protect the delicate float, and so that you can start fishing in a matter of seconds. Floats are attached by threading line through the eye on the side of the body and then securing it with two small silicone sleeves. It's important to use two sleeves so that the line lies snugly against the float. This avoids tangles and protects the stem against snapping. Some anglers still use olivettes to balance their pole floats, but nowadays most use split shot. Split shots are easy to fine-tune and are more versatile in use. Ideally, you want to shot your float so that only part of the bristle is showing. This makes it more sensitive and a biting fish will feel no resistance. You may need to use more than one different size shot to get the perfect balance. If you do, the lightest shots must go next to the hook. Indeed, it pays to have one or two tiny shots nearest the hook. These are called droppers or telltale shots. They help to present the hook bait in a more natural manner while letting you know instantly if a fish so much as touches your bait. The rig is finished with a small loop at each end of the line. The top loop is slipped into the pole connector on the end of the internal elastic system before fishing. The other is used to connect a hook link via a simple loop-to-loop knot. Once again, the best demo man for the job is Mr. Nudd, so we'll go back to Bob at the bankside and let him do his thing.
That is a beautiful roach. Look at that. Beautiful half-pound roach. This is the knot that you use to attach your rig to the actual pole connector, and it's called an overhand loop. All you do is you take your main line at the end, you double it over. Now everybody knows that you must make a loop. Most people do the wrong one. Just double it over like that and then form a loop with your hand. So in effect you've got that. You see that okay? This loop here then, now this is called a figure of 8 overhand loop. You need to get this loop, take it away from you and pull it round the back. So get the loop, take it away from you. You actually grip it again with your finger and your thumb and tuck it back through there. And then you're left, can you just see that figure of 8? That if you look at it and you've got that, then you know you've done the knot correctly. Just wet the knot, a little bit of water, spit in this case, pull it tight, and that is the knot that you need to use. It's a really strong knot. I can pull that as hard as I want, it won't break. If you do a normal granny knot, it will break first time, and then all you need to do is just trim off that little piece of surplus there, and you've got an absolute perfect knot. What happens with knots is the line cuts into itself and it makes it much, much weaker. So you just need to trim that off. Scissors are a bit blunt, like that. And there you have the perfect loop done. That's the one to use for your pole rigs.
I think that's okay to follow. What's great about videos and DVDs is the ability to pause, rewind, etc., and just work it through. Remote to hand, lump of line in your mitt, practice with ease. Let's move on. Pole fishing can be quite strenuous, so if you want to avoid backache, you have to get comfortable before you start. A seat box with adjustable legs is the ideal choice. This allows you to set the height so that the box is level and your thighs are parallel to the ground. You'll then find it much easier to balance the pole across the tops of your legs, or you can tuck the end beneath your crutch and rest your elbows on your thighs. Try both ways and see which one you find the most comfortable. You now need only 3 essential accessories before you can start to fish: a rig, which we'll look at in a while, a disgorger, and a landing net. Always use a landing net on carp. It protects both the fish and your tackle. Smaller fish can be swung to hand, but if at all in doubt, or at least until you've gained some experience, use a net. It's also a very good tool for slipping fish into a keep net, with minimum fuss for bigger species, as we shall also see in a little while. Next, a simple plastic disgorger costing a few pence makes the removal of hooks quite easy. But buy 2. Always have a spare. The lesson of attaching it to a loop around your neck is quickly learnt, when you've lost a couple to wind and water. Lastly though, you do need a rig. Ready-mades are an excellent way to start, saves a lot of messing, but if you're ready to start making them up yourself, here's Bob with a good all-round starter that'll get you going and also keep you there.
Let's start from the business end. The hook. It's only a small hook. It's a size 20. Another one of those planes, there's loads of them about today. Size 20, Tubertini 808. A nice fine hook, but very, very strong. And then the line is 09, which is probably about £2 breaking strain, so reasonably heavy, so like that big fish I just caught, you can land it. The main line is 012, which is £3 breaking strain. And I've actually joined the two with a 4-turn water knot. You can just about see it there. 4-turn water knot. You can see I've got a small shot, a number 11 shot tight against that knot. Then if we move up the float, I've actually got a small bulk there of 7, number 10 shot. So a little bulk just to drop down, and then it's sort of midway, so it drops down and goes through. The float is 0.4 of a gram, 414s. It's a Drennan pinky float. It's got a small cane bristle, nice visible bristle, carbon stem, a very lightweight float, you know, very, very small float. And then the elastic, which I said was a number 6, it's a number 6 Camasan elastic, and it's going all the way through those 3 sections, so there's plenty of room. If I do hook a big fish, I can actually land probably a £6 carp on this gear, you know, without getting broken. So you always have to match your elastic to your hook. You know, don't use sort of light line and small hooks with heavy elastic. Your elastic has to give, otherwise you just bump everything. So very simple rig to catch plenty of fish.
Okay, we're almost ready to start now, but here's something very simple that's vital, and you need to learn the technique thoroughly. It's called plumbing up, a and even world champions have to plumb their swims every time they go fishing. There are many different types of plummet, but they essentially perform the same task. They're used to tell the exact depths and contours of the swim in front of you. Attach the plummet to your hook and then push out your pole out to its maximum length. Lower the float until the plummet touches bottom. You can adjust the float now if you like so that it's set at the exact depth. By testing the depth to the left and right, you'll immediately see if the lake bed has an even depth or if it slopes down to one side. Now work the float back towards you and see if you can find any significant changes in depth. You'll be surprised what this simple trick can reveal. Changes in depth are called shelves or drop-offs, and fish love to swim around close to them. Imagine food items falling into the water. They roll down the sloping sides of shelves and collect on the flat areas or ledges at the bottom of the slope. Use the plummet to find the flat or flatter areas of your swim, and you'll then be fishing in the most likely spot for a fish to come looking for food. So once you've chosen your spot, you need to take note of exactly what the depth is. The best way to do this is to place your hook in the end of the next pole section below and then mark the pole with a blob of Tipp-Ex where the tip of the float rests. Should you lose a hook during the day or have to change floats, you can set the depth exactly without having to go through the whole plumbing process again. The next step is to adjust the float so that the hook is set slightly over depth. About 3 inches, 75mm, is a good starting point. Begin the session using the bulk and droppers rig, and make sure that the nearest shot to the hook, or telltale, is positioned so that it's just off the bottom when the float cocks. This is very important. If the shot moves, the float moves. You'll now have to make a choice about what bait to use. It's always a good idea to have a chat with the on-site bailiff or the fishery owner about this, because they'll have up-to-the-minute information about how the fish are behaving. Fish can be very choosy about what they eat, and the best bait today may be very different to what they preferred last week. Your choice of baits can be broken down into 3 principal categories: natural baits, such as maggots, casters and worms; supermarket baits, bread, cheese, sweet corn, luncheon meat, bacon grills, meatballs, pepperami, even pasta; and finally, man-made baits like pellets and pastes. Let's keep things very simple to start with and use sweet corn. Corn is a fabulous bait that works all year round, but is much better through the warmer months for some reason. It's cheap, effective and simple to use. Corn can be used on its own, but we'll introduce 3 small balls of ground bait initially to lay down a small carpet of attractors. With luck, it'll attract some fish into the swim quickly, and they will begin looking for food. Better check with the fishery rules first before using it though. Some fisheries only allow certain types or limit the amount that you can introduce. Ground bait should be mixed thoroughly and kept fairly dry. Use a sponge to add the water. This gives you a degree of control. Mixed properly, it breaks up quickly and gives the fish very little to feed on, except the corn we're using. You can also use a pole cup to introduce the ground bait accurately. You can throw it in by hand, but it could land in the wrong place. Ideally, you need to lay your hook bait right on top of or immediately next to the ground bait. That's easy if you place it in the exact spot with a pole cup. The next job is to cup in a few grains of corn, and we're ready to fish. If you've spoken with the fishery owner or bailiff, you'll have some idea of where to fish, what the species are that you're most likely to encounter, and how big they run. Time dictates that we're going to have to move on from pole fishing shortly, but here's Will Raison into a big carp, not unusual for him, and during the course of this play there's a lot to learn from Will about the techniques needed to land big fish successfully. Remember that apart from a bit of tackle limitation, you can't legislate for size when it comes to fish deciding whether to go for your hook bait or not. You could go fishing for the first time and get yourself a whacker.
Cool, that one's really gone off. That's definitely a big carp, that one. Just gonna have to put the pole right down. Oh, can really, seems to have stopped. Really is. It might be time in a minute to put the extra sections on, but it seems to, he really tore off then and he just seems to have stopped. I'm just gonna create an angle with the pole. Try not to push the pole or point your pole straight at the fish the way it's pulling. There you go, I've managed to turn it by creating an angle on the pole. As the fish was running out that way, I put the bend in my pole. So not only am I playing it with the elastic, but with the actual pole, the way that the pole was bending. And that's coming in quite nicely now. It's not beat by a long way yet, so the key here is just to take your time, but always be on your guard, because if it runs off, you're going to have to follow it all the way out and maybe even put your sections on. It's still kicking a little bit. It's a good fish, definitely a carp. Still pulling. So I'm going to just put my sections down there and see if I can get his head up. He's still pulling. It's right out there still. So definitely a good fish, this one. I just felt it ping off its fin. It's definitely a carp. Yes, see him swirling there. Key is again not to rush, just take your time, because you can see then he just had a little bolt then. Just put the pole down and create an angle. Should stop him, but if they go to run off, you've got to be ready to put your bits on. Like this one's going off again. I'm just going to put my bits back on. Just follow it. It's a big fish, this one, for the pole. I'm just going to take my time and try and make sure that I get it in. Again, using the pole as well as the elastic, the bend in the pole. It's very important to do this. If you point your pole straight at it, you've got no bend in your pole and you're not using your pole to the full capability. He's in again. It's right up there still. Feels a good fish, probably £5 plus. Yeah, he's still got to be careful because there's some rushes down on my right hand side and I don't want him to dive into them. He's off again. Doesn't like being hooked, this one. Got to be ever so careful when they're running like this. Gonna have to put my bits on again. But don't worry if you have to keep putting your bits on and taking them off. It's about getting the fish in that counts, and just use your pole. This one's really woken up now. It really has. Just using the pole as well as the elastic to try and stop it, but it could even be a bit bigger, this one. It's right out there again. Almost where he went on his first run when I hooked it. Gone right out. He's really going now. I've got to be careful now. Again, just trying to use the pole to stop it. It's a big, big fish, this one. Either that or just a really fit, smaller one, but he feels ever so heavy on the pole. He goes again. This wind is absolutely perfect for this peg. I think we're going to hook quite a few on the pole today. I just want to try and get this one in. Here he comes. One good point when you're fishing like this is to always have your sections to hand. As you can see, I have a little pole peg, just drop them in, because the worst thing that can happen if the wind blows your pole sections away is the carp runs off and you're going to have a job and it'll probably end up breaking you by the time you've reached for your... He's right down here now. It's a good fish. Yes, it's a good fish. If he goes again. Yep. Looks to me to be a nice carp, probably about 6 or 7 pounds. It's on the pole. Oops. I didn't like that landing net then. He hasn't gone too far. I think he's pretty much tired now. If I can just get his head up, he should be mine. You see, I'm supporting the pole in my groin just to give me a bit of leverage so my arm won't be aching at all and I can concentrate 100% on getting it in the landing net. Just take your time, wait for his head to come up. He's still going. Here we go. Yeah, he's a big fish, this one. He's been caught before, he knows what's happening. Trying to get his head up. Come on. Come on, up you come. I've got maximum pressure on the pole and the elastic, so it's just a case of waiting and letting it tire and come up. Come on. Really can't get this one's head up. It really is going for it. Oh, it's a nice common. Might even be a bit bigger than I thought. I can see him coming round now. Watch the landing net out the way. Guys, if he turns this time, I should be able to net him. There, I've got him. Yeah, it's bigger than I thought, that one. Lovely fish. Just ship the pole in. Oh, that's probably about 7.5 pounds, maybe even 8. Just get the disgorger, look, about 1 inch down. And that is a nice carp to catch on the pole, by anyone's standards. Absolutely beautiful fish. Pristine condition, not a mark on it. Hopefully, there's plenty more where that one came from. Gonna just pop him in the net, nice and gently, using the landing net. Off he goes.
Although pole fishing is possibly the most effective way of catching fish from commercial still waters, taking them on rod and line, using a waggler, can be much more fun. A waggler is a type of float that's attached by the bottom end only. Waggler fishing also enables the angler to fish beyond the reach of any pole, and it gives you a better chance of landing the fish you hook at very short range. Big carp in particular will feed within inches of the margins in water that barely covers their backs, but hook them on a short pole and you'll struggle to add sections quick enough to land them as they rush off at high speed. Many fish are lost in this way, and a waggler gives you much better control. You'll need 3 important accessories if you're going to fish with a waggler. First, there's a silicone adapter into which the float is pushed. You'll also need a rod rest
Another breed.
and a catapult for loose feeding.
In the mouth, I can just see it down there.
Setting up is the same as any fishing really. Get sorted, get comfy, mix your ground bait, plumb up. Little more difficult with a rod and line, but you'll get the hang of it with some practice. You need to find some features if they're out there, and there are no easy shortcuts. When you've chosen a spot, and you know the exact depth, set the float so that you lay a bit more line on the bottom this time. Anything from 6 inches to 18 inches is about right, and you're ready to fish. Check or mark the exact depth against your rod. The old Tipex trick works best, so that you can play around with your fishing as much as you like, but you'll always know the exact depth. Before you can begin fishing with a waggler though, you need to set up the float and master the basic art of casting. Setting up to fish with a waggler is dead easy. Thread an adapter onto the line and push the base of your chosen waggler into it. Adapters make float changing very easy, especially if it gets windier during the day or you need extra weight to fish further out. Let's join Bob at Taswood Lakes on Norfolk, where he's getting into a very good session on the waggler, and see what rig he's running today.
Let's start. I always call this the business end, the hook. I thought I'd start with a lightish waggler, so I've matched it to a fairly light hook. This is one of my favourites. It's a Tubertini 808, a size 20. It's got a good gape on it, strong. It's just a good hook for catching everything. And the hook length, now when you're using a hook length on a waggler, it's generally sort of a reasonable length, hook length, and this one is probably something like 18 or 20 inches. 18 or 20 inches long. I've put a little shot on the hook length, and I often do that. A number, you can just see it there, right in the middle, a number 9 shot. I like to have a shot fairly close to the hook so that I can actually see. That gives you indication of the bite. Now, this is what I use to join the hook length to the main line. It's a barrel swivel, number 30 barrel swivel, tiny, and I've got a tucked half blood knot each end, one with the main line going to it, one with the hook length. And this swivel, if you're fishing say with double maggot and you're spinning it back maybe 20 metres, it's like a ship's propeller as it's coming back through the water. And then this fine line, because it's only 0.12mm diameter, this hook length, 0.12, that would spin up. So you really do need that swivel. Then I've got the main line with another number 9 shot. I've got 2 number 9 shots actually down the line there. That barrel swivel is probably equal to a number 9, so it does take a bit of weight. I've got 2 number 9 there, and then coming down to the float itself, and this, see this funny little attachment here? It is a float attachment, exactly what it says it is. And what it does is, there is an alternative. You can put shots either side of the line to hold the float on, but this is just much better, stops the line being damaged. These 2 shots here are really just extra weight to balance the float. They're number 3 non-toxics, but they're just to balance the float up. I've got a little link on there so I can change this float. These are incredible floats actually. They're a Drennan called a loaded peacock waggler, so they're peacock. It's got the size on there, 1 3/4 grams, which is just over 2 treble A, for those people that like to talk in treble A's. But at any time of the day, I can untake this apart, just unclip that there, just unclip that, and put a bigger one on. Say it gets windier and it's more difficult to control, I can put a bigger waggler on. I can also just pull this insert out. That unclips. So I can change the floats that way as well. A bigger float with the same weight, and all these weights are clearly marked on the float itself, the actual size of the weight, and you can interchange them and do whatever you want with them. Absolutely brilliant. So that's a really adaptable insert waggler. And an insert waggler is really what you use fairly light fishing, fishing on the drop, sensitive fishing. It's where you've got a thick piece of peacock going into a smaller piece. The main line itself is fairly fine. It's 0.14 millimetre diameter, and I mark that clearly inside the spool. I actually write 0.14 millimetre so that I know on the different spools I have, and that's running up then, and you've got to match this line to the float. You know, if you try to use too heavy a line, the float won't cast, so keep the line fairly thin. But it's probably about 4 or 5 pound breaking strain. It's a Browning line. It's a feeder line, but it's very, very strong. And that really completes this sort of light insert waggler setup.
Watching how well Bob demos his stuff made me remember how difficult it used to be to follow knot tying from line sketches and still photographs in books before we had videotape. It sent me hunting through the library to see what I had from him on knots, and I found these two wonderful examples that fit in really well here, both applicable to the waggler and indeed any form of coarse angling.
Just move round a bit so there's a bit better light so that you can see this knot, because it's one that I think is very important. It's called a tucked half blood, and it's a knot that I use to attach my hook length to a barrel swivel or the main line to a barrel swivel. So it's exactly the same knot. You do 5 turns. Actually what you do is you thread the line through the swivel. I've already done that just to save a bit of time. That's threaded through, and then the loose end there, which is about 2 or 3 inches long, twist that round about 5. You can 5 or 6 times. I usually do it 5 times. So you get the line. I know it's ever so hard for you to see this, and every time you twist it, let me change hands there so you can see. Every time you twist it, 1, 2, you have to actually hold the barrels with your left hand, 3, 4, 5. So every time you twist it, right, you're holding the swivel and that little loop of line with your thumb and your forefinger of your left hand, as long as you're normally right-handed. Then you're left, once you've twisted it 5 times, you're left with this little tag. See this little tag here? Tuck that back through that loop, right? Put it through that loop. As you put it through that loop, what you'll find is, I've put it through that loop now, I'm then left with another loop here. Now, if you just pull it now, it will slip. But if you tuck this, still the same little end piece, tuck it back through, and this is where the word tucked comes from. So just tuck it any way, it doesn't matter, you can tuck it any direction, as long as it comes through that loop. So get it there, pull it back through the loop, so that's a tucked, pull it down. Now as you pull it down, all knots need just a little bit of lubricant, so I just wet my fingers, just will lubricate the line, then pull it tight. I just grab my clippers and I can trim off that little end to make a perfect knot. Just trim that quite tight, just you can leave a little tag, and that is a perfect and incredibly strong. You can pull that, I mean, knot strength is so important with lines. You can pull that as hard as you want, it will not go. So you've got a perfect knot that will not break. There is another alternative way, if you haven't got a barrel swivel or if you don't use them, of tying or attaching that main line to the hook length, and that is probably the most common one. It's called loop to loop. But what a lot of anglers do, they don't know how to tie a loop properly, and I'll just show you how weak line can be if you don't use the correct knot. And this is the knot that most anglers use when they're doing a loop. They fold the line over like that, and then they put the line round their fingers, 2 fingers, like that, and they pull this little loop through here, like that, wet it of course, like that, pull it tight, and they think, oh, that's a lovely loop to loop. But that is not a correct one, because what happens is, and I'll just show you here, now this line is 4.5 pound breaking strain, but I'll show you what happens if you don't tie the correct knot, how easy it can break, right? No pressure on that, bang, as easy as that. 4.5 pounds, no problem. The knot you must use, and it's so simple, is an overhand loop. So you do the same thing, right? You fold your line just the same. So you've got your loop. You actually have got your 2 fingers there, the thumb behind it, and you form this loop that you would always do when you're doing that. It's a granny knot, that other one actually, but loads of people use it. So you've got a loop and that. Now this time, bring this piece of line back and bring it back through here. It's then not cutting in on itself. So you bring it back, right? You bring it round, you bring it, so you put it away from you, bring it round and you bring it back. You bring this little loop back through the line there. Let me show you. Bring it back and through, like that. And you get, if you look at it then, you get a sort of like a figure of 8. If you can just see it there, sort of a figure of 8, and wet it again. Pull it tight. So you've got a figure of 8 loop now, and that is much stronger. If you do that test on there now, right, put that line on there and test it. You test it. And pull and pull and pull, and you can't break it. It's incredibly strong. That's the difference. Just that figure of 8 loop. Now you won't lose any more fish. Just do that.
Casting is quite simple, providing you've loaded the reel correctly. To cast a float, you simply open the bail arm, trap the line on the spool with your forefinger and sweep the rod towards the place you want the float to land, remembering to release the line when the rod is overhead. Try it a few times and you'll soon get the hang of it. Always cast beyond where you want to fish. Dip the rod tip and reel back swiftly to sink the line between your rod tip and the float. The float should then end up exactly where you want it, with the line sunk. Another way is to dip the rod tip, tighten up and then lift smartly. The reason you do this is to overcome surface drift, which will pull the float out of the position if you don't. Practically any bait can be used with a waggler, certainly all those mentioned in the pole section, but the waggler does lend itself perfectly to fishing with maggots and casters. Fishing at distance means you'll have to use a catapult to get loose feed into the swim. Try and get into a rhythm of baiting regularly. It's very easy to forget and then bites will dry up. You can bait very accurately with a catapult if you practice enough, even when it's quite windy. If the float doesn't settle when you expect it to, that means a fish has intercepted the bait, and this is every bit as much a bite as when the float disappears completely. Watch out for bites like this. If you're not certain, strike anyway, just in case. Striking into bites is very much a personal thing, but the best way is usually to sweep the rod in a controlled manner to your left or right. Keep the tip low and be ready to stop as soon as you feel the fish. In deep water, or if you're fishing close to the rod tip, it may be better if you strike vertically. Immediately you hook into a fish, it's likely to charge off at high speed. You must be ready. If the reel's anti-reverse is on, then you must have the clutch set so that the fish can take line without breaking away. The other way is to give line by backwinding. How you play fish is a personal choice. Even top international anglers disagree on which is the best way. When loose feeding, it's common to find that fish, especially species like roach and carp, will begin to compete for the free offerings and swim higher in the water to gain advantage. This normally happens in summer and when the water is warm. Eventually, the fish are dashing around just under the surface. Often you'll see the swirls. And unless you change tactics and fish very shallow, you will stop catching. The answer is simply to shallow up, so that your hook is barely a foot below the float and have no shot whatsoever between the two. It's a good idea to switch to a clear-bodied float when fishing shallow because it's less visible to the fish. Bites can be savage. It pays to position your rod at 45 degrees to the water and keep loose feeding on top of the float. The float will spend much of the time dipping and bobbing as fish bump into the line, but don't be tempted to strike. These are not true bites. They're what we call liners. When a real bite does occur, the fish tends to hook itself and the rod tip pulls round. Don't strike, just lift the rod and start playing the fish. Catching this way is one of the most enjoyable ways to fish on a bright summer's day when other methods are far less successful.
In complete control all the time. As I said, the bars of soap are really good. Look at the beautiful, it's sort of like an orangey greenish tinge. Beautiful red rimmed and then the black eye. Perfect fins. And just a little bit of slime up the line. Terrific fishing. Can you see those two red maggots? Look, just there. Hook's only just on it. Here, let's unhook it. Just hooked. Might need to just put my disgorger on that just to make sure that it's right in the top of its mouth, but sometimes it's easier to use the disgorger. What about that? Terrific fish. What, talk about a hard fight.
There's little doubt that to catch fish from a river using stick float tactics is one of the true delights of fishing. But it requires a lot of hard work and practice on the part of the angler to develop the necessary skills. Don't be put off by this though. It's within the capabilities of anyone to learn, and when you crack the art of presenting a bait under a stick float, you'll never look back. Rods designed specifically for stick float fishing are widely available, but there's no reason why you cannot use the same rod you use for Waggler fishing. Stick float rods have hollow carbon butt and middle sections, like a Waggler rod. Where they differ is in the tip section. Stick float rods have a fine but solid carbon end spliced into the tip. This gives a rod that reacts far more quickly when the angler strikes, and that results in a higher bite to hooked fish ratio. There are scores of different stick floats to choose from, but really you can split them down into two families. All share similar balsa top sections and differ mainly in their stems. The first group have cane or lignum, which is a dense tropical hardwood, bases. The second have wire or alloy stems. Cane stems are used when the water is smooth and not too fast. When you encounter boily water, the best option is to use a wire or alloy stemmed float, which acts like a ship's keel. These are more stable and ride the current better. Stick floats are attached using silicone rubbers. Most writers suggest you use 3, but on cane stemmed floats you can actually get away with 2. As before, you need to plumb the depth prior to starting fishing. The trick when stick float fishing is not to do this directly in front of you, because the flow will push the float under every time. Instead, you should swing the plummet out at 45 degrees downstream. This allows the float to perform a vertical arc, popping up and then sinking. Set it too shallow at first, and gradually increase the depth until the float appears. Working out the exact depth with a stick float is less exacting than the methods described earlier, because you can fish well over depth with a stick float if the riverbed is clean and free from obstructions. For the best description of the right rig to start stick float fishing, let's join our Bob on the River Wye on a rather dull and rainy day.
My basic rig for today for stick float fishing is starting with the hook. I've got a Camasan B611. It's a fairly strong hook, but quite small. The fish are fairly wary. It's summertime. The level's probably normal summertime level, but the water's clear and fish can see hooks, so you have to be careful. Then I've got a 2 3/4 pound breaking strain line. It's 013, a high-tech line. Don't worry about using high-tech lines. If you've got a nice soft rod, which I have here, you can get away with using a high-tech line. Once again, the fish don't see the line so easily. I've got the actual float is 8 number 4. It's a lignum stick with a shoulder on it, but so I've got 8 number 4 shots equally spaced down the line. Equally spaced, so it drops through the water. Look, they're 8 number 4s, non-toxics. And then the stick float itself has this shoulder, so that I can actually hold to this shoulder. There's a fair bit of pace on the river. And it's got a lignum heavy base for casting. You'll see that I'll do a nice underarm cast and I can cast to the middle of the river. You need a fairly weighty float. The main line is £3. It's a Drennan float fish. It's 3.2 pound. It's probably 0.17 diameter. But when you're fishing a river like this, you need to float your line on the top, on the surface, so you can actually keep mending, lifting and mending and coming back behind the float. So you need a floating line, not a sinking line. So Drennan float fish is very, very good for this. The rod itself is a brownie naturally. Wouldn't use anything else, but it's a 14-foot rod, so I can actually get behind the line and use it. 14 foot, but very light, only weighs 5 ounces. And then the reel is once again a Browning Syntec match. Just a fairly light reel. A good wide spool so that the line will run off the spool quite easily. So that's basically the kit that I'm going to attack the river with today. And then on top of that, I'll just be loose feeding. The actual bait will be loose feeding maggot.
To start fishing, you should first check the depth of the rig against your rod in case you lose a hook or have to re-tackle. This way, you'll not need to re-plumb. A good tip is to use the smallest hook you feel comfortable with. Smaller hooks mean more bites, especially in winter, but it's no good using a tiny hook if there are just big fish around. And remember, river fish fight much harder than their still water cousins. Instead of casting the float out over your head, try to master the art of the underarm swing. This will result in less tangles. Sweep the float across your body so that it lands at the head of the swim with the float upstream and the hook downstream. It really is an easy cast to master with a bit of practice. Try to make the float land just beyond the range you wish to fish at, so that you can draw the float back into the exact line, and in the process this straightens out the tackle. Now your bait will fall through the water in a more natural manner and attract more bites. With the bail arm of the reel open, allow the float to run downstream at the speed of the current and watch for any unusual movement. If the float vanishes, this could be caused by the hook dragging along the riverbed and catching on something, or it could be a bite. Strike! Remember to trap the line against your reel spool when you do this. If you connect with a fish, then great. If not, check the bait. If it's marked, then a fish was the culprit and you missed the bite. If it isn't marked, or it's covered in weed, shallow up until you can run the bait through the swim without hindrance. Bites can also be detected when the float doesn't settle properly. The float lifts by the smallest amount, or it begins to move at a different speed to the current. Watch out for them all, but if you're in any doubt, strike. You've nothing to lose. You must feed a small amount of bait every run down if you want to get a shoal of fish feeding in your swim. The amounts do not have to be big. Often you'll feed just a half dozen maggots or casters, but you must keep them trickling in. This is where most novices let themselves down because they're trying to concentrate on so many other things. Proper feeding is vital. If you get lots of bites, step up the feed rate. There are more fish in front of you than you first thought. When bites begin to tail off, cut back on the feed. Simply match your feeding to the number of bites and you'll not go wrong. Introduce the bait slightly upstream of you, or directly in front if the flow is slow or the water shallow. Try to work out where the bait hits the bottom, because this is where the fish will congregate and where you should get the most bites. Pay more attention to this area and make sure you mend the line prior to the float entering the hot spot, not in the middle of it. Presentation is a key element in stick float fishing. Keep an eye on the line next to your float. Does it form a bow and sneak in front of the float? If it does, your presentation will be affected. When you spot it happening, lift the rod and mend the line. Try not to pull the float off course, but make sure the line lays straight beyond the float as you lower the rod. This is particularly difficult in windy conditions, especially if the wind is in a downstream direction or straight in your face. Striking has to be a controlled action. Don't go mad, but keep it low and crisp. You'll soon get the hang of it. So, keep the feed going in, mend the line at the right time, and concentrate on the float for any slight movement. Do this, and you're halfway to becoming a successful stick float angler. We're into the last 15 minutes on this programme, and with time against us now, I'm going to go over from Bob Roberts on the River Trent to Bob Nudd again on the River Wye, demonstrating feeder fishing on rivers, far better than I can talk it. Over to you, champ.
Thought this would be a good time to go on the feeder. And what I've done to start the session is I've thrown the feeder out about 20 times, no hook on, no bait, but just keep throwing it out where I'm going to fish to get some bait down there. A mixture of sort of hemp and caster. Get this back in. Across the river. Just a mixture of hemp and caster in the feeder. So it's lying on the bottom waiting for these sort of barbel and chub to come up. It will lay, the hemp in particular, will lay pretty still. Casters will move a bit in a flowing river, but hemp and casters. And I've got a basic feeder rig, and I'll run through that in a minute with you, but it's a good way to fish for quality fish. And I'm putting they like casters on this river, so I'm putting 4 casters on the hook. Just threading them on. And then in the feeder I've got a mixture, just a mixture of caster and hemp. So put some caster in first, just tuck that into the feeder, a little bit of hemp on top. I'm actually putting a maggot in there to make sure that feeder lid is staying tight, just to clip that in. Just jamming it in, keep that tight. And then throwing across to the far side, 4 casters on the hook. And you have to wait for a bite, but you want the feeder, you want it to keep going in fairly regularly, to keep a feed pattern going in. Lovely, spot on that one. And then as the feeder hits the bottom, I'm paying out some line, a little bit of line, just paying it out to put a bow. Create a bow in the line. And what this does, it means that you need less weight to hold bottom. The actual line will give a little bit. If you tighten up to it straight away, you'll find that you'll need to fish a much, much heavier feeder to hold bottom. And the actual bite, when you get it, will be what we call a drop back. The actual fish bangs down on the bait, and with the actual ferocity of the bite, it will move the feeder and the tip will fly back. Sometimes the feeder will move just on its own, and in that case the tip just moves back. When you get a bite, it will go down and then back again and be a more sort of violent action. But what you have to do is it's the same really as float fishing. You have to keep working at what you're doing all the time. You have to be only so long out there, say 3 or 4 minutes, waiting for the bite. If it doesn't come, and you know that you sort of think the feeder's going to empty, there's only caster and hemp in there, so it's the flow of the water will push that bait out. Once you think it's out and gone, then you need to come back in and refeed. All fish, particularly big fish, you know, they can eat an enormous quantity of feed, so you need to keep baiting up all the time. And the idea is, of course, your hook bait is lying below your feeder, and the actual casters and hemp are trickling out and going down towards your hook bait. The fish then will be picking away at this hook bait, and then yours is in amongst it as the free offerings are going through and they grab hold of it. That's the idea of feeder fishing. And usually on this sort of river, on the Wye, you will catch your better quality fish in this style. You just leave it out there a little bit longer. And now and again you can actually move the feeder. You can actually pick your rod up, just move the feeder, and it'll empty a little bit of more feed out. And quite often you then get a wallop, a big bite when you do that. But as I said, it's exactly the same as float fishing. You have to keep working and working at it all the time. In and then out, reel in and cast again. And you only need 1 or 2 big fish, you know, and that's been well worth it. You don't get a bite every cast, only unless you've got small chub in your peg, but if it's big fish you're after, you catch 1 or 2 and then you might scare them. There's a little bit of weed running through now, probably this rain is pushing down a bit. I actually had one of the casters smash them, but could be just a little fish or the impact of the feeder when it hits the water. So it's necessary, bait up, top up, cast out, and try and get in the same. I'm not using a line clip today because I'm feeding out a bow. Try to get in the same spot every time. And then you'll find the fish will eventually come onto your feed. And usually the harder you work, the more fish you'll catch. So all the time, I'm trying to get this feed in, trying to work it, paying out the line. As soon as the feeder hits the water, just let it hit the bottom and then pay out some line so you've got this good bow. And this means it will hold bottom much easier. What you want to do actually, I've got this feeder balanced. It's called a balanced feeder so that we get this drop back bite when the fish takes. Of course, it doesn't want to bounce along the bottom all the time. It wants to stay fairly still. But what I'm looking for is a feeder to be still, but as soon as a fish bangs it, for the feeder to actually move and lift. And all you have to do then, when you get the bite, is actually just pick up and lift into the fish. It's not a violent strike, but if you pick up, I'm using a long rod here, so if you pick up and you get straight into your fish, then you hook it quite easily. This feels like a good fish. I thought it would work coming onto the feeder. Yeah, big fish this. Really good. It's really hugging the bottom of the river. Of course, with the bait I'm fishing on here, which is like 4 casters, tends to eliminate the small fish. That is really putting a bend in this rod. But it is fantastic fishing here. When you're playing these fish, actually, would you believe this reel I'm using hasn't got a clutch on it, but haven't got the anti-reverse on, so if the fish wants to run, I can just backwind on the fish if it really wants to go. And because I'm fishing right on the other side, it's taken a fair while to actually get the fish in. It's really powering in. I'm guessing it's a barbel. You know, one of the fish that we came to catch. That rod is bent over double. It's terrific, it really worked well. There. Coming in. I'm still putting a bit of feed into the middle of the river to try and keep them stick float fish going, but you know, this might be one of those sort of days when it's a feeder day. Probably is a barbel because it's powering upstream now, which is normal. But I'm really putting a lot of pressure on this fish. Look at that, rod's bent over double as I'm trying to get it in. It's typical of a barbel to run upstream. Yeah, I've just seen the fish there under the water. Just caught a glimpse of it just under the water. It's a barbel, not a massive one, but you know, a good fish, sort of an enjoyable fish. They really are one of the hardest fighting fish, pound for pound. I can actually hear the line singing, whistling through. The fish is upstream, just upstream, sort of there. Bringing him steadily in. Here he comes. Oh, it's a good fish. It's a lovely fish. Look at that. Just see him under the water then, below the feeder. Look at that for a beautiful barbel. Oh, even this fish is making my arms ache. I'm actually pulling at it. See how it's trying to get upstream all the time. They actually help you, you know, when they run upstream. They don't realise it. If they was to run downstream, you'd probably lose them. But good barbel like this always tend to run upstream. That is a lovely fish. Look at that. Just take my time with it. Get him on the top. I've got a fairly strong rig and I'll run through that in a minute with you. Look there. There she comes. That is a one fit fish. Got to watch it because I've got some branches just below me, so it's not easy to actually look at that. Ooh, still not given up yet. Here it comes. I've just got him on the top. Trying to make sure it doesn't break me. I really are. Still hasn't finished yet. Can you believe that? Still fighting all the way to the net. I'm taking my time with it because it is a good looking fish. Look at that. There. Just slide the net under it. Take it easy. That is quality. Let you have a look at this fish. Oh, that is a gorgeous barbel. Proper fish. Hey, that works straight away. And a big fish too. Didn't think it was as big as that. Look at that. Guessing what that is, £5 I should think, or more. Maybe more. Just a beautiful fish. Hooked. Can you believe it? I don't know if you can see that. It's hooked just in the lip. Little 16 hook, and it's hooked just in, but it's right in that hard, muscly part of the lip, which means that you're never going to lose it. Unless they actually break you, that hook is never going to pull out. But I'll be as careful as I can in unhooking it. Just get it. Just get my disgorger in there so I don't damage the fish. There. Look at that, eh? A beautiful £5 wide barbel. Might even be more. I'd like to weigh that. That is gorgeous. Just slip him into the net. I'll just run through my rig that I'm using today, because it's quite important how you set a feeder up. So I'm going to tell you about it in fair detail. I've not got a massive hook on. I've got a 16 Colmic N500. They're called nuclears, but they're a very, very strong hook. In fact, I used this hook in the World Championships in Spain. I used a size 12 then, catching carp. You know, it really was a strong, powerful hook, never bent out all day. And when you're fishing for these big barbel, you must have a strong hook, because they will straighten you so easily. Then I've got my hook length, which is, in high-tech terms, it's 0.16 millimetre. Now that is probably about 4 pound breaking strain, so it's quite strong. I've got a 2 foot hook length coming down to the actual main line. Now what I've done off of this feeder, and it's quite ingenious really, I've got about a 9-inch length of line. I've put a big loop in it, and then if you can have a look along here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate knots where this line is doubled up. And what happens is, in flowing water, the water actually will push into this heavy line and actually lift it above the weed. Just lift it and give the bait some movement. So that's important in fish catching. Then the feeder itself, I've got a 1 ounce block end feeder, good size feeder as well, get plenty of feed in it. And I've put that on just a small 4-inch loop, so that will slide just those 4 inches. And in fact, if the fish really takes it violently, you almost get a self-hooking action. I only go that far and then bang, that will pull the hook into the fish's mouth if you're catching really big fish. Now the line, once again, this is a big river, big feeders, powerful fish. I've got the line diameter is like 0.26 mil. It's a normal mono, not high tech. Don't forget, you want a normal reel line, and that's something like 8 pound breaking strain. Sounds a lot, but you need it because you're continually casting a big feeder, and you can weaken line. You know, it might be all right when you first put it on and have 2 or 3 chucks with it, but when you're continually casting, you actually wear line a little bit. So if you get any weak spots in it and the line's too thin, it will break and your feeder will go. So you really need to fish fairly heavy. So nice heavy line. I've got a sort of a 3 ounce tip, good heavy tip, because there's a lot of pull on this water. And you can notice also a big reel here with a wide spool. This is a Browning Ulti-Match there. And all I do is back wind when I hook a fish. It hasn't got no clutch. And the rod itself is a 13 foot big feeder rod, powerful. It's called a Browning Advanced Super Feeder. It comes in a sort of an 11 foot or a 13 foot mode. I can use it either way. But a big powerful rod. You need a 13 foot rod because I've got the rod up in the air, keeping it above the main flow, which is coming down this inside. If it's shorter rod, what you find happens is that you will actually have more of your line in the flow, so you'll need more of your weight on your feeder. So rod length is very, very important. So that basically is a setup. Then all you have to do is make sure you keep casting in the same spot, and then you'll catch some big fish.
That's it. We're out of time. The hardest bit about these programmes is not what you want to put in, it's what you have to leave out. Still, maybe next time. From Will at Gold Valley, Woody on the Wye, Bob Roberts on the Trent, Bob Nudd at Taswood, and Liam Dale all over the place. All the best, and we hope this programme keeps you safely and successfully on course.